Okay, so we got to talk about a couple of loops here, and they're referred to as the negative feedback loop and the positive feedback loop. So let's start with the negative feedback loop. This is by far the most common. It's probably the easiest to understand because it's one that we have all experienced, multiple times. And so we're going to use the example of increased blood pressure. So I've had people in the past tell me that my voice is kind of annoying, maybe it's a little bit nasally. Whatever it is that bugs people about my voice, I apologize. But let's say that you have just an immediate, horrible reaction to my drony, nasally voice. So let's pretend that as you were going through these modules and you listen to the other professors, everything's good, and all of a sudden here I come with this horrible voice that you just can't stand. And let's exaggerate the situation even more and say, every time you hear my voice, you just want to punch me in the face. That's fine, that's your right. But let's say that when you hear my voice, all of a sudden you start to feel yourself getting kind of anxious. You feel your heart starting to beat faster, your blood pressure starts to increase, you feel kind of enraged, which obviously is an exaggeration, but let's say that that's what happens. What happens then, or if we look at this from a homeostasis look, let's go back to our chart. You had some sort of stimulus that disrupted homeostasis. Or in this case, you had normal blood pressure until I started talking, and now your blood pressure has started to increase. Well, you've got receptors in your vessels called baroreceptors that are going to monitor pressure. When you hear on the news that the barometer has increased because a storm is moving in, they're talking about pressure changes. So a baroreceptor in the blood, or in the blood vessels, is going to be sensitive to changes in blood pressure. So your blood pressure increases, your baroreceptors detect that, and send a signal to the brain. Well, the brain says, well, we've got increased blood pressure. That's not what we want. We need to be at balance or have normal blood pressure. So it's going to send a signal or an output to the heart to get the heart to decrease. Or in other words, it's going to say, hey, our blood pressure is too high here. One way we can bring this blood pressure down is to decrease heart rate, which is going to decrease the total blood volume that's coming out of the heart and is going to hopefully return blood pressure to normal. I think the example in your book or in your study guide talks about a teacher telling you you've got a pop quiz. If you're going to survive that pop quiz and not have a coronary and fall over in your chair, you need to reduce your blood pressure and return to homeostasis. So your body's going to go through this process of recognizing that something is bad, it's out of place, and it needs to be returned to normal. This is what we refer to as the negative feedback loop. Now the positive feedback loop is a little bit different. Now this is something that's happening that's good for the most part, or it's some sort of change that should be occurring. Only we don't want to have that change or that process occur forever. So what the positive feedback loop is it's a mechanism to keep something going until we reach that certain endpoint. And probably the easiest positive feedback loop to understand is the process of childbirth. Now, I got 4 kids of my own. I did not birth them, so I can't speak from the first person, but I can tell you a little bit about how this process went down. And this is going to be maybe a little bit different or change kind of halfway through this for cesarean deliveries. But essentially what's going on here, so we start to have contractions. The baby is going to position itself in a place to be born, and that head is going to start putting pressure on the uterine cervix. Well, as that pressure on the cervix increases, the cells of the cervix are going to start to stretch. And as they start to stretch, one consequence is obviously discomfort. And I'm sure all the women out there who have had kids would want to punch me in the face for referring to the pain of childbirth as discomfort. But initially, it's probably more discomfort than full-blown pain. But as those cells that are sensitive to stretching recognize the stretching of the cervix, they're going to send a signal to the brain. And the signal is going to say, hey, this baby's starting to move and starting to put pressure on the cervix. It's time to get this guy out. Now, a long time ago, there were a lot of theories on why this happened or why a baby started that birthing process. Some of them were super wacky. Nowadays, we have a better understanding of the baby's development, and we believe that surfactant levels in the baby's lungs are going to initiate that birthing process. We know that there are other things that can induce childbirth, but let's just say in a normal situation, the baby is fully developed, we've got an appropriate amount of surfactant in the lungs, they're developed and ready to start breathing, baby starts to move, the cervix starts to stretch, and now the brain receives this signal. Well, what that signal needs to do is it needs to continue the process of stretching so that the baby can enter the birth canal and be born. So what's going to happen at the brain is it's going to release oxytocin. And oxytocin then is going to act on the muscles of the uterus and continue that stretching process. It's going to induce, obviously, the stretching, but also more contractions. And so we've got this positive feedback saying, hey, what's happening here needs to continue happening. Go, go, go. This baby's about to be born. Let's continue pushing and stretching until this baby comes out, and then we can stop the process. So that release of oxytocin and then other signals that are going to be sent are going to contract and start pushing that baby out. The body stretches and the baby is born. And once that baby is born, we're going to break that positive feedback loop, or we're going to stop it. We don't want a mom to continue contracting and pushing and contracting and pushing and stretching for days or weeks or who knows how long after that baby is born. And so it's a feedback mechanism that's going to stop at a certain point. In this case, when the baby is born, we no longer need that positive encouragement to keep contracting. Does that make sense? I hope I didn't slaughter that for those of you who have had children. It's a much more intense process than I described it. Obviously, if that stretching isn't occurring as it should, or even the contractions aren't occurring as they should, and the body's in danger, we can go in and perform a cesarean section and remove that baby from the uterus, without a vaginal birth. But anyway, this is a good example of a positive feedback loop. So to contrast and compare these two, so if you look, homeostasis here are positive feedback characteristics. They're going to strengthen or reinforce a change. They're going to cause something to continue happening until it stops, in other words. Or we get a process up to a certain point. Once that process has reached the point it should reach, then we need to stop it. So another thing to remember with this, they don't happen very often, or they're conditions that aren't very common. Negative feedback, on the other hand, is very, very common. And so what we're trying to do here with a negative feedback loop is we're trying to reverse a change that's heading in the wrong direction. We're trying to return the body to that controlled, balanced condition that it was in previously. So the action's going to stop automatically when we reach that set point. In other words, my cheesy example from earlier, when my body got too hot, as soon as I got back to where my body temperature was okay, I stopped sweating. Can you imagine what would happen if we didn't have that negative feedback loop? And you get back in the classroom, you've been in the classroom for 20 minutes, and you're still just sweating profusely. It would be kind of embarrassing. So, the final thing to remember with homeostasis from this chart here on the right is that these are going to regulate those conditions that happen quite often. So we see them over long periods of time. They may be occurring. They're going to happen multiple times per day. It's just the way life works. All right, so a couple of examples to remember. For positive feedback, we talked about childbirth. We could talk about severe blood loss. So we're going to continue bleeding until wherever that bleed is occurring has been repaired. I worked for a long time in the medical laboratory. We would see people that would come in with what was called triple A's, or abdominal aortic aneurysms. So if you think about it, an aneurysm is a rupturing of blood vessels. If that's happening with your aorta, you're going to be in trouble pretty quick. And so these people would be basically bleeding out of their aorta. Well, that blood loss or that bleeding would continue until the person either clotted or that rip or that tear in the blood vessel was sutured and repaired. And then finally, blood clotting. And blood clotting is a good one to think about as well. It's a positive process. We want it to occur. It needs to occur up to a certain point, but then we need to stop that clotting process. So if you get a cut and you're bleeding, you're going to have a chemical reaction that's going to initiate the coagulation cascade, or the process of clotting. Well, this clotting is going to occur to the point where that blood loss has stopped, or we've started the process of repairing those vessels or tissues that have been damaged. In some cases, when this positive feedback loop doesn't work as it should, the clotting process can continue on too long. And so there's a disease called disseminated intravascular coagulation, or coagulopathy, where people start to clot too much. And they can get clots throughout their vessels of their body and even in the brain. And that's obviously a very bad thing. So it's important that the body can control these processes and make them happen up to a certain point. And then with the negative feedback, there's many examples that we could talk about. We covered body temperature. You could think of electrolyte balance in the body. So if you're exercising and you're losing electrolytes and fluids, you may end up with a disruption of that balance. And now you've got way too much sodium, for example. So you're drinking water to try to balance out the concentration of sodium in the cells and tissues of the body. Or our blood glucose levels. So there are people who are diabetic and they don't produce enough insulin or insulin at all, or the insulin that they produce is dysfunctional or doesn't work right, or even it could be that their cells aren't sensitive to insulin, and therefore their cells can't take the glucose from the circulation into the cells. So in this case, we've got a disruption in normal blood sugar levels. And so the body's going to work to return those to normal. So in a diabetic situation, they may not have the insulin needed to return to equilibrium. And so they have to take synthetic insulin to have that process take place. In a normal person, you go to 7-Eleven, you buy a Slurpee and a bunch of Skittles, you eat it all in half an hour, your blood glucose is going to increase. That's just how it works. But in a normal healthy situation, your body's going to respond by releasing insulin. That insulin is going to facilitate the movement of that glucose into the cells where they can be used, turned into ATP, or stored for future use. Whatever it is, that insulin is going to be the response to try to get that blood glucose back to normal levels. So I hope this discussion has helped. I hope that you've got an increased understanding of what the body's doing to try to return to homeostasis. Maybe I'll leave you with one cheesy example or analogy, and you'll find as you hear me in different modules for this course, I like the analogies. So one of my favorite movies is the Disney Pixar film The Incredibles. So if you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch. But so they have this son, and his superpower is that he's very fast. His name is Dash, and he can run exceptionally fast. Well, at the very end of the movie, his parents have decided to let him enter a track and field competition. Well, at this track and field competition, they don't want everyone to know he's got a superpower. So if he won first place by, a mile, it would be very obvious. But they also want him to do well and place and get a trophy, so they don't want him to come in last place. So what I picture, and this is where the cheesy analogy comes in, is the parents, as they're standing in the bleachers and cheering him on, they're kind of maintaining homeostasis. They're trying to get him or keep him kind of in the middle of the pack. And so at one point he starts to pull ahead and he's running too fast, and they yell at him, no, slow down. So he starts to slow down. He hits that middle point and they kind of calm down, but then he starts to slow down too much, and they yell, speed up. And then he speeds back up, and it goes on like that until the end. But the way I think it applies to this is that's what the body's doing. If something is too far out of whack, it's going to try to bring it back to the middle. So if my temperature gets too hot, the body is going to cheer it on and say, no, let's cool you off. We need to get back to the middle. Likewise, if my body temperature starts to get too cold, then I'm going to have goosebumps, and we're going to try to get those hairs to stand up to trap a little bit more heat. Or I'm going to start to shiver and create that muscle energy that produces heat in the body. And so I'm trying to get to the middle point or to the balance there. And that's going to happen with many, many different processes and functions of the body that we'll talk about in later modules.